In the late 1970s, the United States was facing one of the most challenging economic crises in its history. Inflation was soaring, unemployment was high, and confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy was fading. Into this chaos stepped Paul Volcker, the newly appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. What followed would become one of the most controversial and consequential episodes in modern economic history: the Volcker Shock. The 1970s were characterized by extreme economic turbulence. The Bretton Woods system, which had pegged the US dollar to gold, had collapsed, and the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 sent prices through the roof. The US economy entered a period of stagflation, a mix of stagnant growth and rampant inflation. Traditional economic models were failing. President Jimmy Carter was under intense pressure to solve what seemed like an economic puzzle without a solution. Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in August 1979. Standing at 6 feet 7 inches tall, Volcker was physically and intellectually imposing. He was also unafraid to break with economic orthodoxy. Volcker believed that the root of inflation was too much money chasing too few goods. His solution? Stop the flow. He decided to adopt a radical new approach, targeting the money supply instead of interest rates. On October 6, 1979, the Federal Reserve announced a dramatic change in policy. Instead of controlling short-term interest rates directly, it would control the amount of money in circulation. The immediate effect was skyrocketing interest rates. By 1981, the prime lending rate had reached an unprecedented 21.5%. Mortgage rates climbed above 18%. For many Americans, the economy suddenly felt like it had been hit by a brick wall. But this was exactly what Volcker intended. By restricting the growth of money, he aimed to squeeze inflation out of the system, and it worked, but at a tremendous cost. The Volcker shock plunged the U.S. economy into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment rose to nearly 11% by 1982. Entire industries like agriculture and manufacturing were decimated. Small businesses struggled to survive. The high interest rates made borrowing nearly impossible. Farmers burned their equipment in protest. Construction workers marched in Washington. Volcker became a villain in the eyes of many, but he held his ground, repeating his belief that inflation was the greatest enemy of economic stability. In congressional testimony, he famously said, "Inflation is like alcoholism. The cure is unpleasant, but staying on the bottle is fatal." By mid-1983, the tide began to turn. Inflation had fallen from over 13% in 1980 to just under 4% in 1983. The economy began to grow again. Interest rates stabilized. A sense of confidence slowly returned. Volcker's gamble had paid off, at least in the short term. But the costs were significant. The recession had scarred millions of lives. It reshaped the political and economic landscape of the United States. And it raised a difficult question. Was it worth it? The Volcker shock is still hotly debated. Supporters argue that it laid the foundation for nearly 2 decades of economic stability, known as the Great Moderation. It restored the credibility of U.S. monetary policy and showed that central banks could tame inflation. Critics, however, see it as the beginning of a new era of financialization and inequality. They argue that Volcker's policies entrenched the power of Wall Street and contributed to the decline of manufacturing in the United States. Global debt exploded. The shockwaves of the Volcker era contributed to the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s and set the stage for structural adjustment policies worldwide. Today, as inflation returns to the headlines and central banks once again grapple with rising prices, the Volcker shock offers both warnings and lessons. It reminds us of the power and peril of radical policy changes. It raises questions about whose interests monetary policy serves, and it underscores the importance of economic balance. Paul Volcker made a bet on the future. He placed the stability of the U.S. economy above the immediate suffering of millions. Was he a hero or a villain? Maybe both. What's certain is that the Volcker Shock changed the course of history. It was a financial gamble that saved, or perhaps doomed, our money.